Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Michaela Peters. I'm doing this thing where I'm sitting on the floor, which really bothers the Russian side of my channel, so it's kind of funny. And I just wanted to demonstrate the aura of random crap that exists in my grandparents' house to, again, make the point that it's a hereditary thing, having too much stuff. I really go to my relatives' house, I'm like, how do they have so much stuff? And then I'm like, it's why I have so much stuff, and it's part of why I don't want to get a big house, because I don't want to fill it up with stuff. Although this right here is my fault, because these are clothes my grandmother was giving me, so I just put them all there, and I've kind of been wearing them, and then I'll put them in my suitcase, which is a mess over here. Okay, so I wanted to talk about how my last 24 hours actually went pretty well. Yeah, I don't really like discussing politics on the channel, but this is just a statement of what is going on. So, and people know this has been in the news, that they're trying to cancel the Fulbright program, which, is why I went to Finland. So instead they had this sort of Finnish embassy in agreement or whatever, correspondence with US kind of educational objectives. And it was cool because actually this one Finnish guy who works for NASA, Goddard Space Center, and who's pretty high up at NASA as a deputy director and stuff, he came and talked about some of his research, and it was pretty interesting. And I'm thinking so he's a citizen because you can't work at NASA as a civil servant without being a citizen. And then he showed a timeline and showed how long it took him to become a citizen, and I think it was something 12 years or something long, or 8 years, something like that. And I was just wow. But it was pretty inspirational for me, because I was I could be like this guy but in reverse, because I could go do that in Finland and then maybe get really high up. Although I'm not really sure, because that'd probably require me speaking Finnish pretty well, which probably would never happen. So I don't know, but that was pretty cool. And then I added him on LinkedIn, and then he accepted me, because my LinkedIn picture is my NASA picture, and all the NASA people know what the NASA picture looks like, because it has the NASA flag and the American flag in the background, which is the same picture on my channel. So it's my go-to picture. I one time had somebody tell me it was false advertising for using that, and this was several years ago. This was 3 years ago, because you don't look like that anymore. And I'm just I mean, my hair is not as blonde, but whatever, because I stopped coloring my hair, because I still don't have gray hair, so I'm waiting for that, and then I'll start coloring it again. Anyway, I digress. But it was really cool, and, my grandmother's well, why are they doing this thing? And it wasn't necessarily a Fulbright event, and I'm well, they're probably just trying to keep the cooperation between the US and Finland going in the absence of the actual Fulbright program existing. So I think that's why that was happening. But it was really funny, because not our whole cohort, but some of the people our cohort my year, and then the cohort the year after, they were all there, and 2 of them flew from Texas. It was pretty crazy. And I was I'm not sure I would spend my own money to come to this 2-hour thing if I wasn't conveniently located near it, which I'm not that conveniently located near it. But this was part of why I was specifically taking this time now to come down to Maryland to go to that with my grandmother. And she really liked it. And then when the NASA guy was done talking, it's does anybody have any questions? And she immediately raised her hand, because this is the kind of person she is. And then I don't even know what she asked. She asked something about related to his research. I was wow, she was really paying way more attention than I was. So that was pretty cool. And one of my couple friends, as I call them, so a married couple who are my friends, they recently bought their first property too, and I was super excited about that, and super excited for them, and interested to hear how the whole process went, and that was really cool. And so it's nice to kind of see what's going on in everybody's lives. I also was talking to one of my friends' moms, and we had a really interesting conversation about family, and mostly about family. And that was, it's sometimes I like talking to people who objectively they're not invested enough in my life to tell me to do one thing or another, and that's kind of refreshing sometimes, getting that outside perspective. Okay, so there was all that, and that was really cool. We had a nice time. It was great. Loved it. The food was excellent. I got to eat some brownies, so my favorite food ever. Yes, okay. I'm also trying to do this when nobody's here, and I don't know if that's going to work, because my grandparents also have some other guests who are here right now, who I was oh, were you just driving through to see somebody else? They're no, we came to see your grandfather. And I was both happy and sad about that. But these are some long-standing family friends, and my grandparents have a lot of those. And anyway, so really what I wanted to make this about, aside from just this Fulbright, or this not Fulbright event, but this Finnish embassy event being so awesome, I was really wanting to talk more about talking to your grandparents. And, I understand how fortunate I am to have grandparents who are still alive. And I said this to one of my Finnish friends, and he had a very interesting reaction to it, which is that I do feel like my grandparents have been more of parents for me in my life than like my real parents. And I think a lot of people feel that way. I don't think that's like uncommon. I think that's pretty normal and fine, and it's like okay to feel that way. But like, and I've also traveled pretty extensively with my grandparents, and my grandparents have visited me in Finland. They visited me in Kyrgyzstan when I was studying there. Like, they're a lot more like worldly, if you will, with like the traveling around thing even than I am. Although I think I think they've still been to more countries than me, and I've now been to 50 countries. So one thing I really like about my grandparents is that, the more I've learned about them, the older I've gotten, is that they've been in some pretty crappy situations. I mean, obviously that's how getting older works. Like, you've had both more good experiences and more bad experiences. But I'm very impressed with the way that they handle adversity. And so what do I mean by that? There have been instances where they'll tell me a story and it's very clear that somebody like very grossly wronged them. And instead of holding on to that anger and that resentment, they just kind of let it go and they just move on and like, keep going about their lives. And I try to do this, but like they're way better at doing this than me. And so last night, I was going to go to bed, but then I just talked to my grandfather casually for an hour, and it's pretty interesting. And like, I discussed this a lot, like having a religious background and stuff, and how that kind of obviously like feeds into other things in your life. And my grandfather's very like, let's say, spiritual man in that sense. And so, when I asked my grandfather, like, how do you do that? He's like, well, because it's in the Bible. And I'm like, I mean, that makes sense. So like, and he'll quote me things or he'll show me things and he'll be like, read this Bible account. And so like, this is when he's like, here, read this Bible account from Jesus. I was like, okay, that's cool. Which like people are like, what? But, I really kind of like that, because to me, that takes the whole like organized religion, aspect out of it, which I know a lot of people are kind of like, have more feelings about, and you're just reading, like, you're reading a book and you're assessing it at that point, which I like that part. So, he's kind of explaining to me how, like, all the things that, he has done, it's just that he's learned it from the Bible. And I'm like, well, duh, like, it makes so much sense. And it's just really, you have to be very diligent about not forgetting those things. I think that's the biggest thing, because it's easy to know that I should do this thing, but it's a lot harder to actually do the thing. And this is why advice is so stupid sometimes, because people tell you to do stuff. You're like, oh yeah, that's really good, I should do that. And then you don't. It's like the whole go run 5 miles. And it's like, it's much easier to say that than to actually do it. I've talked about this before, but, one of the things that we were talking about yesterday, it was essentially just about how being angry is kind of useless. It's like, and this makes so much sense. And I quoted back to him what my grandmother told me, and I'm going to start with that. And this is my grandmother on my mom's side, not his wife. This is the other grandmother. She said, holding a grudge, and she used to tell me this a lot when I was younger, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And my grandfather said something similar, where he's like, you can feel angry and you can feel resentful and hurt at somebody, but in the end, like, it's not doing anything to them. It's just doing something to you, because you're the one who's experiencing that emotion internally. And I'm like, nah, that makes sense. Like, duh. And I just kind of started thinking about that, and I've quoted this recently, and I think about this one a lot too. It's like, most people are too busy and preoccupied with their own lives to really like care that much about what you do. And I get to an extent, like, people are still like social creatures and like care about what other people do and are like curious about other people's lives. But like, the reality is, and this is, like strictly from a survival perspective, like, people are not as concerned with your life as they are with their own life. Like, that wouldn't really make sense. And you can only control your own life. So again, why would that make sense? So I just thought that was, helpful and interesting. And I was like, no, he's like got a point. And it's just, it really made me, well, and then, my kind of counter argument was like, if you don't like something, why are you going to keep going back to it? Like, if I don't like olives, which I don't, surprisingly, even though I'm Italian, whatever. But like, I've literally never liked them, and I try to make myself eat them now, especially on pizza, and it sometimes works, but it's still kind of hard. And, I don't really like them, so I'm probably going to avoid them. And I'm like, well, it's the same with people. Like, if you don't like interacting with people, you're probably going to avoid them. And, there are a lot of other reasons why interacting with people can be difficult. I actually started Googling what is prosocial behavior this morning. I'm not sure why I started thinking about that, but essentially it's like for the benefit of other people, but it may not always be clear to you at the beginning that's for the benefit of other people. And one of the things that I think about very specifically with myself is like, just engaging with other people, like talking to other people, responding to other people, letting other people share their struggles with you, being empathetic towards other people's issues, giving people advice when they're seeking it. Like, all these things are categorically pro-social behavior. And one of the criticisms that I get a lot from my family is like being selfish and, etc. And that's fine. I say that people can think whatever they want about you, but like one of the things that I really struggle with is like I have a lot of friends and I have a lot of people who like want to be my friend and spend more time with me, and it's like more than I can give. And this has been like a recurring problem my whole life, and this seems to be something my dad has struggled with. And yeah, that was actually another thing I was asking my grandfather, was like about his kids and like, how he thinks about his kids and like what things he's been happy with, what things he's been disappointed in. And I'm like, well, why is my dad so different than my uncle? Because like my uncle's like very invested in his kids in a way that like my dad just like wasn't as visibly, like in terms of like my uncle just engages with his children, like likes to talk to them, likes to be involved with them, and my dad's sort of like, I'm just going to provide for them, and that's like my job is done. And my grandfather is explaining to me like, well, he's always been much more like task oriented and like success driven, whereas like my uncle is more like free spirited. And I was like, okay, that like makes sense as an explanation. And he kind of like drew on like how they acted as children to like sort of explain why. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, I'm kind of like my dad more so too. Like I'm much more like structured and like, well, maybe that's not really the word anymore, but like a little bit more rigid in terms of trying to like achieve things and get things and like focus on the goal rather than just like being free spirited, quote unquote. Like people kind of like think like I have this facade of being free spirited because of how much I travel, but like that's all very, structured and like I want to go to this country and reach this amount of numbers, and it's almost more like metrics rather than just I feel like going here spontaneously. Okay, so I don't know, but I just thought all the stuff my grandfather was saying was making sense. And then he told me some stories about his childhood and like how he grew up and like what his family was like growing up and how that affected him. And I just think it's really like a blessing, I guess, to be able to have older relatives who can share with me like what it was like when they were younger. And I had a conversation with my grandmother like a couple weeks ago or last week or something, and she told me about her childhood too. And I just tried to focus on like having relatives I enjoy spending time with and I enjoy talking to, rather than categorically being like I just want to get away from my family because they're stressing me out and like telling me what to do. Because while that is true, it's like trying to understand it from their perspective. That was something I was listening to in a YouTube video because, like maybe it is really like they care about me. They want to see me not make mistakes. They want what's best for me. But at the end of the day, like you still have control over what you do. And so that's something I'm trying to focus on right now, even though I feel like I've kind of been in a situation where I felt very out of control for, the past year and a half or as long as this housing problem has been going on. So, I'm pretty excited at this point to just get it over with and move past it and like live my life. And, I'm hoping that's going to work out. So that's where I'm at today. All right, well, I have a work call right now, of course, so I'm going to go. But hopefully, that was more positive, because sometimes I feel like I travel and I have these experiences and I feel like more positive and I can bring that to the channel. So yes, I guess the moral of this story is talk to your grandparents, because obviously they're a lot older and they have a lot more wisdom. And if you don't have grandparents, find a random old person and start asking them questions about when they were young. I think that could probably be beneficial too. I do that sometimes, not going to lie. All right, so that's everything for today. Until next time, bye.